I think there's probably 3 or 4 things that are important to keep in mind. The first issue is that anything that results in foreign policy from any particular government, whether it's a developed country or a developing country, is really based on the domestic policies of those countries. You can't have foreign policy without a foundation of domestic policy. And domestic policy then, in respect to climate, bears on the perceptions that the population of individual countries have with respect to the challenges posed by climate change, the costs and the benefits, and basically what is this going to cost to deal with it. I think that's true in the U.S., it's true in the EU, and it's certainly true in the BRICS countries, which is Brazil, India, China. And so the second thing is, I think, to realize that the major emitters that we're dealing with are competitors on the global scheme. So China, the EU, the U.S., Russia, India compete with one another politically, and they compete with one another economically. And therefore, whatever we do in terms of climate change, it's got to be in some sense what you might call be competition neutral. In that sense, there cannot be massive amounts of wealth moving among these competitors that would disadvantage one competitor versus another competitor. And so I think you need to kind of take that in mind. The third point is, I'd say a lot of things we're talking about in terms of organizing international regimes will be based around large-scale carbon markets or flows of money from Annex I developed countries to developing countries to entice them to undertake particular kinds of domestic actions. Given the current world status right now of fiscal status of the developed countries, massive amounts of flows of currency working in those particular directions, I think, is not very viable, even if it's through a carbon market. So again, I think there's a difficult problem we face in bringing these large-scale economic and political competitors to the table to discuss climate change when there's larger political and economic issues that are on the horizon. The first issue that faces the present administration is that the U.S. needs to undertake domestic action. And this is the big problem right now, is what would the U.S. do? How aggressively would it go after greenhouse gas emissions and reducing those emissions? There's a bill that has just been introduced in the U.S. Senate, which I think would position the U.S. well with respect to its leadership in the world, but it's very unclear whether that's going to pass the U.S. Senate or not. If that does not pass, it does not mean the U.S. is not going to take domestic action. The Clean Air Act, which is one of our major environmental statutes, is in place, and we will regulate greenhouse gas emissions under the Clean Air Act. So I think the U.S. will become a player on the world stage with some credibility, but it may take a few more years for that to become apparent. Then, of course, the administration is heavily engaged in discussions, bilateral discussions, certainly with China and India, to provide incentives for those countries to join a larger scale action across the major emitters or the major economies to reduce emissions. And so I think the U.S. administration is certainly very much committed to bringing those countries into the fold in some sense to reduce emissions, but that's all predicated on the assumption that the U.S. will get its own house in order and reduce its emissions at home. There are bilateral incentives with respect to China having to do with trade and property rights and technologies and what have you. Again, I don't think there's going to be an awful lot of enthusiasm with respect to the U.S. Congress for massive amounts of money to flow from the U.S. to China. The investments the Chinese are going to have to undertake themselves, but I do think there's going to be coordination with respect to trade, international technology flows, intellectual property, and what have you. The role we play as a research institution, as opposed to an advocacy organization, is to help inform policymakers about the options available and the strengths and weaknesses of each option. At least in the U.S., there's usually a window within these political discussions, perhaps early on in those discussions, where the policymakers are truly interested in understanding the pros and cons of different sorts of approaches. At some point that window narrows and the politics takes over. And when the politics takes over, resources for the future necessarily has to leave the stage. But right now, with respect to U.S. domestic politics, that window is still open. There are still policymakers which tend to be members of Congress that are very interested in the different options available to the U.S. to control emissions, and the role we play is, again, helping informing them from a science basis, from a research basis about the pros and cons. It's certainly already having an effect on the politics of Washington. It's not clear what sort of, quote, environmental disaster this will be. As you should probably know, the oil has not hit the beaches or the shoreline of the U.S. It's a large amount of oil, but what injuries it's going to end up causing, if any, are unknown at the present time. That said, given the magnitude of the oil that's coming from the well, it is having an effect, I think, in Washington on perceptions about expanding offshore drilling and exploration in the Gulf waters and elsewhere in the United States. How that's going to play out, we'll know within the next few months or so, but it certainly is having an impact right now.